Hi, everyone. I'm Linda Solomon Wood, Editor-in-Chief of Canada's National Observer. Welcome to everyone joining us. Well, I really can't think of a better guest to have with us right now than Amy Goodman, who joins us today from New York. Amy is the co-founder and award-winning host of Democracy Now!, an independent daily global news hour. Amy, thank you so much for making time to be here with us today.
It's great to be with you, Linda, at this absolutely critical moment in U.S. history.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And we have an hour to talk, and I know it's going to go by so quickly. So let's dive right in. We were just watching, both of us, and I'm sure our audience too, hearing Trump say from the White House that he won the election. He's still speaking. He is calling the polls voter suppression, the polling that was done during the campaign. He is calling the Republican Party, the party of inclusion, the party of working people. He said the election was going to be stolen. He said that before, that it was going to be a fraud, and now he's running with it. He said it destroyed our system about the mail-in ballots, that our system is corrupt. And he said he's gone from winning by a lot in different states to being even down a little bit. Amy, where is this going?
Well, I certainly do not have a crystal ball. I don't know where it's going, although it does look like Biden is ahead. And I do know that Trump lies as he breathes. It is a terrifying spectacle to watch this man give a speech from the people's podium, because that's what the White House should be. He's not just speaking from a street corner somewhere and you can decide whether to pay attention. He is not only a presidential candidate, he is supposedly the most, he occupies the position of the most powerful person on earth, and what he says matters. He is lying through his teeth right now, as he says that this election is being stolen from him. You know, Linda, what's amazing about this election is I think, if people are watching from Canada transfixed, and I'm not saying you should be transfixed by all things that happen in the United States, but we are all transfixed and we're all learning equally. Canadians might think they never really understood the US electoral system. Well, neither did most Americans. And to see inside these counting centers around the country, most of us have never seen this before. It is an incredible civics lesson that's taking place right now with our neighbors, our friends, family members going to these centers in the midst of the pandemic that has hit the United States so hard. In fact, it has not, I just want to say I was watching this from the corner. This was supposed to be a press briefing, by the way, Trump coming out and speaking. He spewed a bunch of lies that take lives, and then he walked out. So he's gone. He's not taking any questions. Of course, I mean, he can't take any questions because he cannot substantiate anything he said, as he came out and said he won the election. Really? What states did you win that would lead you to the 270 electoral votes, votes in the Electoral College that would mean that you're the next president of the United States? But we're in the midst of this worst public health crisis, what Kamala Harris calls this mass casualty event that isn't just a natural occurrence. I mean, Canadians know this because we are hit much harder. Why? Because, well, just, sort of scientifically, we got hit harder? No, because the complete incompetence and malevolence of the person in the White House that should be, at this point, even as we speak, running a public health containment of COVID-19. But instead, he is not only simply campaigning around the country until last Tuesday, he is running these super spreader events. It is absolutely horrifying. If he were to go out, you'd think he'd wear a mask, that people would be socially distanced that he could speak to, and then he'd have the cameras that would project him to the world. That's what Biden is doing. And I am extremely critical of Biden and the Democratic Party, but that's what should be done. Instead, he stands there. Thousands of people are not wearing masks, are crammed in together. He does not wear a mask, and he holds these speeches. I mean, he is the #1 model of what should be done. And what's so horrifying is these are his supporters. They believe him. Stanford University just did a study that shows how many people have died as a result of these events. And he goes to the most hard hit states of this country, the red states, the Republican states at this point, the Midwest, the upper Midwest, are the hardest hit in terms of the pandemic, with overflowing intensive care units, with doctors and nurses and hospital staff on the front line, with mayors pleading with the governor, even Republicans with the president, not to come there because what it means in their communities. But he pays no heed. I mean, going to Wisconsin, that is, if it were a country, it'd be one of the worst in the world right now by itself. And El Paso, Texas, another red state that's increasingly blue, it is overrun with COVID patients. And this is the #1 critical issue of our time. But instead, we have a president who had COVID-19 himself. The White House has become a hotspot over and over again because of this recklessness. And he got it, his wife got it, his son got it, and no one gets the kind of care that President Trump got. Immediately taken to the hospital. If we get COVID-19, we're told not to go to the hospital unless it gets extremely serious. And he gets this combination of medicines that he alone in the world had access to. And where does he go? He goes to Walter Reed Hospital. Walter Reed Hospital, that is the preeminent socialized medicine center in the United States, because it cares for veterans and soldiers. And so like you have in Canada, yes, that's socialized medicine. And yet he walks out and casts aspersions, criticizes, viciously attacks anyone who dares to propose Medicare for all, socialized medicine in the United States. And yet that's why he's alive today. That's why he could leave days later and then head on to the campaign trail. And I just want to say one of the most horrifying moments was to see him head back to the White House a day after being sick himself. He came out of the hospital wearing a cloth mask, got into his hermetically sealed SUV, hermetically sealed against any kind of chemical attack, and forced his Secret Service agents in the car to be there next to this COVID-19 positive infected person and drive him by his supporters, mainly QAnon supporters, this conspiracy theory. And he waved and then went back into the hospital. Wow. The next day he leaves the hospital. He goes back to the White House in a reality show like spectacle. He goes up the steps of the White House. I can't remember which media outlet said, nothing where they give a balcony speech when you look at the world ends well. And he looks out, he gives a salute, he waves, he takes off his masks, and he walks inside the White House. Now, who's inside the White House? The White House staff, right? It's called the residence. And I don't know if anyone's ever seen Tyler Perry's The Butler, the film about a butler who worked in the White House for 8 presidents. It's based on a real story. We interviewed this butler's son. And who works in the White House? Who are the scores of people who work there? Well over 100 people, perhaps 200-300 people. It's older African-American and Latinx workers. They can't control what the inhabitants of the White House do, but they're in this intimate setting with the first family. And here he is walking in, taking off his mask. That's what we're dealing with in the United States today. And just multiply that many millions of times over, because that's what he's exposed people to all over this country as this pandemic. In this pandemic, we were forced to go out and vote, or if we were lucky enough to be protected, an absentee vote. And just a few minutes ago, Linda, he once again cast aspersions on attacked absentee voting. He does it himself. His family, his professional staff, they vote absentee themselves. But what he says is it's inherently fraudulent without any evidence of this. Many states in the United States work wholly off absentee ballots. But he went after absentee ballots early on, and this might have been his downfall. He went after them a little too early and spewed those lies about how they're only the corruption of the system and they are completely fraudulent, because he convinced many Democrats that, you know, it is possible that somehow he will have all these absentee ballots invalidated. And so people actually went to vote early. It's the first time, for example, we in New York could vote early for president of the United States. It's a new thing in the United States in many states. And so there were hours-long lines, up to 10 hours, where people were voting not on November 3rd, Election Day, but it's expanded to a whole season. Because people were afraid to send in their absentee ballots, although many millions of people also voted absentee because we're in the midst of a pandemic. So he makes the pandemic far worse, right? We have 20% of the deaths and infections, and yet our population in the world is a little over 4% of the world's population. And we have 20% of the deaths in the world, and until recently, 20% of the world's infections.
It's unbelievable. Just unbelievable. And Amy, can you remind us of what is at stake for Trump if he loses?
I mean, this is such a critical point. I mean, for a normal president, they lose, you know, in the third week of January, they leave the White House. But for President Trump, he is clearly afraid, if it's dawned on him that he is losing, which he clearly is, as we sit here today, this evening, Linda. The numbers are just amassing because there's absentee ballots in some states like Pennsylvania. The Republican legislature required that you couldn't count them before Election Day. And so that's why it's all put off.
But we've also seen some really inspiring developments, Amy, this election. New Mexico became the first state to elect all women of color to the House of Representatives, and the 4 congresswomen who've been nicknamed the Squad have also been reelected. What do you make of this new wave? This speaks to, yeah.
Right before I get to the Squad, I'll just answer your previous question of what's at stake. A normal president, what's at stake is he goes from the presidency to private life.
Right.
But what's at stake for President Trump is that he could go from the presidency to prison. I mean, I don't know if that will happen. He's being investigated many different ways, both federally and in New York State. He faces the investigations of the district attorney here in New York, of the attorney general in New York. He faces over $400 of loans coming due. We talk about him as the billionaire real estate developer. It's never been clear that he's a billionaire, but that's what he faces. Now, this is in dispute, but he could possibly pardon himself, but that's only for federal crimes. If he pardons himself in the federal system, but he can't pardon himself in the state of New York. So that's why he's like a caged animal in the White House. If he understands, in fact, if he hasn't been deluded by his own lies, that he is losing. And what does that mean? You know, he could face, to say the least, very serious repercussions, not to mention his family facing those repercussions. And it's very interesting to see that he is surrounded. Many people have deserted him. We've never seen anything like it. I don't know how many chiefs of staff he's had, well over 4. Most presidents retain their staff largely. And who he has left is his family around him. And they're not just his family, you know, his daughter Ivanka, his son-in-law Jared, his son Don Jr., his other son Eric. These people are also his business partners. And so that's very serious. And a number of them are being investigated as well.
Yeah, that's very serious. So my other question was to flip it a bit about some of the more inspiring things that happened. How do you see that, you know, this new breed of this new group of the squad that all got reelected, and women of color in New Mexico? Like, is that a counter movement?
It's once again going to be the most diverse Congress in history. You mentioned the squad. My colleague Dennis Moynihan and I write a weekly column, and we just posted our column today at democracynow.org, and then it's on a number of news websites. And we wrote, the headline is "The People Speak, in Squad We Trust." And it is about the squad. And even as you have someone like President Trump, I mean, it definitely looks like he is going down. If our electoral system works, he's going to lose. But we cannot forget that he has received tens of millions of votes. The fact that a few days later, we don't know who is president means he has not lost by a landslide. And that is just shocking when you look at his record of white supremacy, of lies, of xenophobia, his anti-immigrant obsession, the cruelty, the sadism, the separation of children that goes on to this day. But the silver lining of these years has been the growth of movements, both in the streets and in the hallowed halls of Congress. So who are the squad? Let's talk about this amazing quartet of women. You've got Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was tending bar in downtown Manhattan and decided to run this insurgent campaign for Congress, representing various parts of Queens and the Bronx. And she took on Joe Crowley. He wasn't a conservative Democrat. He would walk in Jericho walks around the Federal Plaza where immigrants were taken inside, but he was very powerful. He had been there for many terms. He could have become really the House Speaker. He was like number 4 in succession. And Joe Crowley had been there for years. And she took him on and she won. This remarkable young organizer who has changed this country. And as well as her is Ilhan Omar, who represents Minneapolis. Each one of them won on Tuesday. Ilhan Omar, who is a Somali American, who fled with her family from the Somali Civil War. She is the first refugee from Africa. She came to this country. She is also, along with another member of the squad, Rashida Tlaib, who represents Detroit, Palestinian American. Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar are the first 2 Muslim women in Congress. And then you have Ayanna Pressley, raised by a single mom in Massachusetts. Ayanna Pressley is the first African-American woman to represent Massachusetts in the US Congress. She dropped out of college because her mother helped her whole life. So she wanted to support her mother. And she ends up being the representative from Massachusetts, an amazing group of women. President Trump despises them so much. I mean, he despises women, and he really despises women of He so viciously attacked them, the level of death threats against them. He tells them to go back to where they came from. His problem is they all come from here. I mean, that's where they live. They are Americans. They need increased security, but they stand by their convictions, and they have been such a model for so many as they put forward consistently the Green New Deal, as they talk about Medicare for all. That's not particularly revolutionary in Canada, but in this country, it is a battle that continues to be fought. And they all stand outside the democratic establishment. So what we're going to see now, if there is a peaceful transition of power, again, the election has not been determined at this point. The fact that Trump didn't take questions tonight suggests he knows how much trouble he's in, because this man grandstands. Every moment in the limelight is a reality TV show. He relishes the questions thrown at him because he always knows the answer, because he's always lying. He just makes it up as he goes. But the fact that he didn't now, and the fact that we're watching every single state count ballot by ballot, Republican and Democrats sitting at a table, going through in all over the country. This is how it works.
It's just like incredible watching it, Amy. And I wanna turn for a moment to corporate America, and specifically the oil industry. What's at stake now if Biden is the winner for the oil industry?
I mean, that's a very good question, Linda. We don't know, because I think what's important, whether it's Trump or it's Biden, is that it's not dependent on that person, that man in the White House. What counts now, I mean, the way I see Trump is he literally represented a wall. As you know, his obsession with the wall. He continues to this day, 4 years later, to say Mexico is going to pay for the wall, that he has diverted billions of dollars from the Pentagon to pay for, and still, to say the least, has not fully built this wall. Though where he does build it, he desecrates the land so often of indigenous people along the border in places like Arizona, where we have gone to discover what's happened there. But President Trump represents a wall. Oh, and let me say, he just built a wall 2 days ago. I'm speaking literally.
A wall around the White House.
And right, first it was, a wire wall around the White House. And then he actually built a wall. And that really suggests he understood what was happening, and that he had to wall himself off from the population of the United States. President Trump represents a wall. What Biden represents is, I think, a door. The door is open a crack. He's not willing to fully open it. It's up to people, the pro-democracy movements in the United States, to kick that door open. Otherwise, it will be slammed shut and be the equivalent of that wall. And let me give you an example on immigration. I mean, we know President Trump's views on immigration, separation, thousands of families, the ruthlessness, the horror of what has taken place. The latest numbers, at least 565 kids. We don't even know, the government doesn't even know where their parents are, but they wrested the parents from the children at the border, and they didn't even bother to keep track of their parents. Now, President Trump, his vile language, the way he refers to immigrants, talks about Mexicans from the day he announced for the presidency as, rapists and murderers. The crude way he speaks certainly called attention to his vile policies. But when you look at the Obama-Biden years, the 8 years before Trump took office, I mean, President Obama spoke of all people as having dignity, and his language was deeply respectful. but he deported more immigrants, millions and millions and millions of immigrants than Donald Trump has managed it. And I think we have to look at their policies. And, Biden was his partner. Biden was his vice president. And now if Biden becomes president, Kamala Harris becomes the vice president. And I was just thinking of Nicole Hannah-Jones, who started the 1619 Project about slavery and where our country comes from, the New York Times writer. She tweeted the other day, "I've been so busy, so horrified," she said, "at everything that is happening, that I've forgotten to point out that if in fact the Biden-Harris team wins, all sorts of history is being made, because Kamala Harris will be the first African-American vice president, the first African-American woman vice president, the first woman vice president, the first Asian-American vice president, the first Asian-American woman, right? Her mother was a scientific researcher in Berkeley, researched cancer and died of cancer. She was from India and she came here. Her father was Jamaican and he is a economics professor at Stanford. And so she is Jamaican, she is Indian, she is African-American. She makes history every which way. But your question, Linda, was about the oil industry. Yeah. And while Kamala Harris came out against fracking, and I have to say, it's very much because of the movements, pushing her in that direction. Joe Biden has continually said he will not ban fracking. He started off by saying he wouldn't ban new fracking. That he would ban new fracking. But as President Trump pushed harder and harder in the debates that they had, he ultimately said, as he fought for Pennsylvania and Ohio votes in those places, instead of making a really important educational argument about how you could have so many more jobs by making them sustainable, Joe Biden just said, no, I will not ban fracking. So that's a major problem. But I don't think it's determined by the person who occupies the position of the president.
It's a broader, much broader.
It's determined by the movements in this country.
So on that note, Amy, will there be a pathway then if Biden wins to a new Green Deal in America?
Oh, I think there's no question. I mean, Joe Biden says he doesn't support a Green New Deal, but his energy policies have been supported by more progressive politicians. I mean, you have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who introduced the Green New Deal into the House of Representatives, supporting Joe Biden. Now, she does say on November 4th, and we've passed that, we're now at November 5th and well beyond because we don't know who is president. She did say starting now, the fight has to begin more than ever, but there will be space to be heard. And, we will see what will happen, but it's not even just dependent on the movements. We see what happens when people don't pay attention to science, whether we're talking about COVID-19 or whether we're talking about the climate catastrophe that we are facing right now. I mean, think about the border, the Gulf in the United States, the Gulf of Mexico, Louisiana, Mississippi. I mean, they are so hard hit with COVID and with these ever more intense and frequent hurricanes. I mean, it's all coming together right now.
Well, Amy, I just want to pivot for a moment to your experience as a journalist and some of the things that have happened to you. You reported on the independence movement in East Timor in 1991, and you and your fellow journalist, Alan Naim, were badly beaten by Indonesian soldiers after you witnessed a mass killing of Timorese demonstrators in what became known as the Dili Massacre. Years later, in 2016, you were arrested at Standing Rock during the protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline. Can you tell us how these experiences have shaped your view of the world and of journalism?
Yes, East Timor, 1991. It was November 12th. My colleague, Alan Nairn, an incredibly brave, independent journalist. We went to East Timor. I had gone to Guam, which was American territory, because it's at the time, and this had nothing to do with East Timor, Guam had an abortion case where a mother in the legislature of Guam and her lawyer daughter, her lawyer had sued the legislature over abortion. And it could be that this case would go to the US Supreme Court and overturn Roe v. Wade. And it was an astounding story. And by the way, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, women's reproductive rights, is also at the center of what's happening at the US Supreme Court now, with three of the 9 Supreme Court justices chosen by President Trump, the last President Trump, and the last, of course, Amy Coney Barrett. But since I was there, and I had been always interested, I'd read a lot by Noam Chomsky about what was happening in East Timor. I decided to go from Guam to Bali to East Timor. East Timor is just an astounding story. In 1975, the Indonesian military invaded East Timor, this small island, half island, 300 miles above Australia. The connection to the United States, they were armed, financed, the Indonesian military, armed, financed, and trained by the United States. And they invaded in 1975, and over the next over the next 17 years, they committed one of the great genocides of the 20th century. And I had been reading a lot about this and understood the US connection, but most people in the US knew nothing about this. In Canada, more people knew. Canada was also providing weapons to Indonesia, and the stream of Timorese refugees had gone out into Australia. Alan Nairn and I went to East Timor. It was our second time. We'd gone in 1990 after I had been in Guam. In 1991, we went. It was the end of October 91. And we went because a UN delegation was going to investigate the human rights situation there. And it was the first time a UN body would go to investigate. And we wanted to be there to see what the Timorese would say. They killed more than a third of the Timorese population. Everywhere we heard the same story. If anyone spoke to the UN delegation, the Indonesian military told them they would kill their families to the 7th generation. On November 12th, we understood that there was going to be, the day after we arrived, we went to the church, and the women were wailing in the Catholic church. And we learned that the Indonesian military had surrounded the church the night before and shot at point blank range a young person who'd taken refuge in the church to speak to the delegation. The next day, there was a procession for his funeral, and 1,000 people turned out. They bravely walked through the streets of Timor, terrified of the Indonesian military, but wanted to stand up, chanted, "Viva East Timor, Viva Independence, Viva Sebastião," the young man who had been killed. And we went around the country after that. They decided to hold a 2-week commemoration for Sebastião because we learned the UN delegation wasn't going to come, even though people had dropped out of school, dropped out of workplaces because they wanted to speak to the delegation, were afraid that they would be arrested. On November 12th, we went to the Catholic Church. There was a communion held in the morning, a mass, and thousands came. The priest had to hold it outside, so many came. And then the young people pulled out of their blouses bed sheets and written on them, "Why the Indonesian military shoot our church." They appealed to President Bush, who was president at the time. They appealed to the UN, someone to do something about this catastrophe. And we followed them to the cemetery. And then we saw the Indonesian military marching up with those signature US M16s in the ready position, 10 to 12 abreast. They marched up to the cemetery where people were laying flowers on the graves of their loved ones, young people been killed in the prime of their life by the military. And here the people were trapped because of the high walls of the cemetery. The soldiers marched up 10 to 12 to 14 abreast. They were coming around the corner. Ellen and I walked to the front of the crowd thinking that maybe our presence as Western journalists could stop this attack. And we always hid our equipment, our cameras, our microphones, because if the Indonesian military caught anyone talking to a journalist, they could be disappeared. But now we wanted to make clear exactly who we are. I took my headphones and I put them on my head. Alan put the camera above his head. The soldiers marched around. They swept around the corner without any warning, without any hesitation, without any provocation. They opened fire on the crowd. A group of soldiers then came at us. They took my microphone that I was holding up like a flag. They beat me to the ground. Alan threw himself on top of me to protect me from further injury, and they took their USM-16s and they smashed them against his skull until they fractured his skull. He lay on the ground covered in blood. They were killing everyone around us. A Red Cross Jeep pulled up. We were able to get into it, and dozens of Timorese jumped onto us and we looked like a human mass as the Red Cross Jeep drove away to the hospital. And the killing just continued. But we thought if we could just get a call out to the West to say what was happening. At the hospital, we knew the military would come there. We went into hiding, and we knew the only way to stop the killing, since we had not succeeded, they killed more than 250 Timorese that day, was to get out of the country and let people know in the outside world. We were able to get on the first plane, the only plane out that day. We did not go back to the hotel. I had the Bishop of East Timor, Bishop Bello, we went to his compound. He helped me clean up Alan's head. It was fractured, covered in blood. And I took Alan's shirt and I put it under a towel around my skirt. And we thought if we could get to the airport before the blood came down again, we could maybe get on this plane.
Yeah.
We raced the airport, came out of the country, was able to fly through Indonesia, held a news conference when we got to the United States of National President, and said this wouldn't have taken place if it weren't for US weapons. The occupation would go on for years, but in 1999, the people of East Timor got to vote for their freedom as the Indonesian military burned the country to the ground. The UN ran it for 3 years, and in 2002, the people of East Timor celebrated their independence, and they became one of the newest nations in the world.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And Amy, we have so much still to talk about, and we're heading into the second part of our hour. So I want to try to get back. I want to take us back to the election conversation. But that's just an amazing story, and I'd love to have more time to find out, more about your experience too, being arrested. But for now, I want to ask you about, the violence that's going on right now, and is threatening to go on in America, and how you see that. And we saw armed groups of men demanding to be let in to where the vote count was happening in Arizona. Like, are you concerned about more civil unrest and, even violence in coming days? You've talked about the wall being erected around the White House. You've alluded to, well, we just heard Trump going on and in a scary way about what's going on. And, one question is, do you think that when he talks that way, are his cohort, are there people, millions of Americans, believing these lies? And is he inciting them to violence?
Yes. There's absolutely no question. It is terrifying in the United States for so many people that Trump has targeted, and those he endorses. He doesn't just dog whistle. You have, for example, something like 14 white supremacist men in Michigan who were just picked up by President Trump's FBI, right? Christopher Wray is the head of the FBI, and the US attorney in Michigan, and they've been investigating them. And they had a plot to kidnap and possibly lynch the governor of Michigan. She's a Democrat. She's a woman. She's Governor Whitmer. Trump calls her half Whitmer. And he has viciously attacked her for engaging in responsible public health measures to deal with the catastrophe that is the pandemic. But he sees that as a threat to his power. He wants all economies open. You know, everyone wants all the economies open. And the way you do that is through responsible public health measures. I mean, look at New Zealand. I mean, Canada has done so much better than us. And that's how you deal it. You have to deal with it with science, responsibly, with masks. I have my shield right here, but I don't always wear it down. Sometimes I actually, and that cannot substitute for a mask. I wear 2 of them every day. But Governor Whitmer has been extremely serious. And when she was trying to institute these public health measures, he encouraged people with guns to go to the Capitol. They went with their long guns, a number of them, these people that were arrested. And Trump tweeted, "Liberate Michigan." He did the same with Virginia. And there's a doctor who is the governor of Virginia, "Liberate Virginia." And it turns out that this group called the Wolverine Watchmen, who are connected to the Michigan militia. And you know who else was connected to the Michigan militia was Timothy McVeigh. Right?
That's just domestic terrorism, though.
What's that?
That's just domestic terrorism.
Yes. I mean, we shouldn't even call them militias, but that was their name. They're not militias. They are terrorists. They are domestic terrorists. And both the FBI under Trump and the Department of Homeland Security, I mean, gives me a chill to even refer to, you know, I remember when it was renamed the Department of Homeland Security, the Homeland.
After 9/11.
Hearkening back to, you know, Nazi Germany, the Homeland. But the person who's in the secretary position of the Department of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf, who was, I mean, by a number of investigations illegally put there, even his agency has said that the #1 threat in the United States today is not foreign terrorists. It's domestic terrorists. It is white supremacists.
Yeah.
So these men were rounded up. A number of these guys around the country, whether they're the Boogaloo Boys. I mean, there was an amazing moment at the Republican convention when the Vice President, Mike Pence, was speaking, where he talked about people who, he talked about the mass protests that are taking place in this country, and they're always trying to vilify the protest. And he talked about a federal security guard who was killed named Officer Underwood. And I think it was his sister who was there, and he had her stand up. He made it sound like she'd been killed by the Black Lives Matter movement.
Right.
He had been killed during the time of the mass protests in this country in Oakland, California, but he was killed by a Boogaloo Boy.
And he supported Black Lives Matter, right?
Sorry?
And I think he supported Black Lives Matter. The rest of the family, was that the guy?
And he was killed by a far right white supremacist. And Trump refuses to condemn either the men who were arrested in Michigan, not to mention what happened at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. You know, they're very fine people. And most recently came to Michigan and once again viciously attacked Whitmer after the plot was revealed that had targeted her, where she and her family have to have heightened security, and Trump continues to attack her. And, you know,
it's terrible. It's terrible. Are you concerned? Are you concerned about this civil unrest happening again? Like, I know my friends in New York tell me that the streets a lot of the stores are boarded up. Is that happening across America?
Yeah, well, I don't know about across America, but it is definitely happening here in New York. And it is happening in many places. And I think the biggest concerns have to be around white supremacist violence. I mean, We talked at the beginning, you mentioned, well, these protests are taking place around the country right now.
Right.
Trump is so deeply confused, to say the least, mixed messaging. In the places where he is ahead, but afraid that his lead is diminishing, which is quickly, he is suing the continuation of the count of the vote. That was in Georgia, in Pennsylvania, and in Michigan. But in the places where he's behind, where he thinks if they continue counting the vote, he could be ahead, which is Arizona and Nevada.
Right.
He has people going with their long guns, like in Maricopa County, to the counting centers, and they're chanting, "Count the vote, count the vote." And in places like Detroit, a mainly African-American city in Michigan, they stormed the counting center, "Stop the vote, stop the vote." God. So where he's ahead, he wants the votes counting stopped. And where he's behind, he wants every single vote counted. So this is very serious. You have
it's very serious.
Are dedicated civil, who are dedicated neighbors and friends who are committed to counting the vote. And they are terrified that men with long guns are standing outside, that they are risking their lives to simply engage in the democratic process. It's a very serious issue right now.
It's really hard to believe, as it not being there, it's so hard to believe this can really be happening in America. And we have a question from someone in the audience. Valerie is asking, but why do his cohorts still trust him?
Why do his
cohort still trust him?
I'm not going to say anyone trusts Trump. I mean, think about what has happened over this 4 years. How many people have deserted him? How leaky the White House is. I mean, how much information comes out of the White House, because even the people inside are afraid. We were getting reports all day today. I mean, it's amazing he came outside to speak for just the few minutes he did, but every time Biden speaks, he cannot help himself. And he feels he has to respond. I mean, I have to say, he is a genius at manipulating the media. And that has been true from the very beginning. And he knows that Biden can't go unanswered. And he also understands that this is all a matter of public opinion. It's not just a matter of law. In fact, you know, his case probably cannot be taken through the courts, although Mitch McConnell,
well, that's a relief to hear,
majority leader, has packed these courts from the bottom right to the top. And that's a very serious issue. But he knows, I mean, look back to 2000, Bush v. Gore. Look back to what happened in Florida. And they understood this. It can't just go to the courts. The only thing that will make it go to the courts, they had the Brooks Brothers revolt. It looked like grassroots activists. It was run by Roger Stone, one of, you know, Trump's allies.
That guy who got out of jail recently, you mean?
And he had a trailer there, and he brought in these guys from Washington who were actually Republican operatives, and they were wearing suits, and they stormed one of these counting centers.
Oh my God.
He understood it really needed some kind of grassroots action. And Gore's absolute horrific mistake when Jesse Jackson took to the streets to lead Democratic protesters and those who believed in democracy, because Gore was ahead, to the streets, like the Republicans were doing. Gore called them off, said, "Do not protest in the streets."
No.
What happened? We know what happened.
That's terrible. Yeah, Gore backed down too easily, and I really hope Biden won't do the same thing.
You're from D.C., so I won't blame you entirely.
I'm from, and I really think that was the turning point for America when Gore stood down. Wayne is asking
about and this goes to who Trump is, but also what the establishment and the trajectory in this country. It is not just Trump. Personally, he's an aberration, you know, as he expresses himself.
Yes.
But look what happened with Bush v. Gore. Bush becomes president, and, you know, the 9/11 attacks happened.
Yes.
And then the United States attacks Iraq that had nothing to do with this. And I mean, the Middle East just exploded after that.
A lot more people died abroad under Trump, for sure. I mean, under Bush.
Yes, we have to look very seriously at that. Trump is not an aberration, just psychologically.
Right, I agree totally. So this is a question from Wayne. What measures can a Democratic presidency take to overcome Trump's intransigence until January 20th, short of evoking the 25th Amendment?
I mean, this is a very serious question. We have to see what happens. There has been a very important message that has been put out. And I want to make a comment about the media, because the media increasingly sounds like Democracy Now!, which is an independent, daily grassroots broadcast. And I hope people tune in tomorrow when we're going to be talking about, is Trump trying to foment a coup? We'll be talking about that tomorrow, but people can check us out at democracynow.org. And we're about to celebrate our 25th anniversary in February, in the midst of this pandemic. We won't be having a major event, but just continuing to do our daily work. My colleagues are my heroines and my heroes every single day. But I want to comment on the media, because, you have, Trump TV, that's Fox News, but you also have CNN and MSNBC. And I am very concerned. Trump calls MSNBC MSDNC, like the Democratic National Committee. But I'm very concerned that what's happening right now, I mean, they have finally stood up to a president and called things out. But because he has so directly attacked them, threatened them, called them out by name, threatened their reporters, and so they had to. They have found a backbone, and that's very important. But what I'm concerned about, they will not behave the same way if there is a Democratic president in office as they do with Trump. And we have an obligation as journalists to hold those in power accountable, no matter what party they're from. And what I'm seeing on the networks right now is a kind of rehabilitation of the national security state and all those who represent it. So often the small circle of pundits on television are the former directors of the CIA and the National Security Agency, the Pentagon, and they're not being questioned in the way they need to be, like you were just raising, Linda, when it came to the invasion of Iraq. I mean, President Bush, for example, all of them, their reputation has been so rehabilitated in comparison to Trump. And all of these military and intelligence leaders need to be questioned themselves. But we are in such a dire emergency right now that is not being done. And now they're the colleagues of the media. They are the media. But what happens next? And that is a very serious concern. So the media is essential to the functioning of a democratic society. And we have to make sure it continues to play the role of holding those in power accountable. You've got this small circle of pundits on the networks who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. We need to open up the table that we have these discussions. I see the media as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day. War and peace, life and death, and anything less than that is a disservice to a democratic society.
Well, you've talked about how the media can be used as a weapon for war, and you said that it often is used as a weapon for war, but that it should be used as a weapon for peace. So is that what you're talking about?
Very much so. I mean, we came out of the Pacifica Network that was founded in 1949, a radio network by a man named Lou Hill in Berkeley, California, who said there's got to be a media outlet. He was a conscientious objector. And when he came out of the detention camps, he said there's got to be a media outlet that's not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how the Pacifica Radio Network was born. Not run by corporations, as the late George Gerbner, dean of the Annenberg School of Communications, University of Pennsylvania, would say, not run by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell that are raising our children today. So the first Pacifica station became 5. My station in New York is WBAI. The third station was in Houston, Texas, in the Petro Metro. And it was founded in 1970. In 50 years ago. And when it went on the air, within a few weeks, it was blown up by the Ku Klux Klan. They
What?
blew up the transmitter. KPFT got back on their feet, and a few weeks later, the Klan strapped 15 times the dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it up again. It would take months before they could be rebuilt. This phoenix rose from the ashes. It was blown up in the middle of Arlo Guthrie singing Alice's Restaurant. So he came back to Houston to sing the song, and the station has been on the air since. But this goes to the issue of why did the Klan want Pacifica destroyed, this independent corporate free network? I can't remember, it was the Grand Dragon or the Exalted Cyclops. I often confuse their titles, but he said it was his proudest act. And I think that's because he understood how dangerous independent media is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And if you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it is a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, whether it is an uncle on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in North Dakota fighting the Dakota Access Pipeline, or it's an aunt in Afghanistan. When you hear someone speak, you begin to understand where they're coming from. I didn't say agree. You may disagree with the person vehemently, but when you understand where they're coming from, it makes you much less likely to want to destroy them, because they remind you of your uncle, even if you don't like him, or your brother, or your sister, or your cousin. And I think that kind of understanding challenges the stereotypes and the caricatures that these hate groups feed on, like the KKK. I mean, that understanding is the beginning of peace. I think
Amy, I feel like we just hit into the gold. That was just so beautifully said and so really inspiring to hear. Thank you so much for that. And we have one more question that like I said, the hour has gone by really fast. Do you have any last message for us in Canada as we are all sitting on the edge of our seats, watching this unfolding for you guys in the United States and, feeling a lot of anxiety and hope?
Well, I think we have a lot to learn from Canadians. I think it's very important that I mean, the US is the most powerful country on earth. And now we've become number one in the world for infections and deaths when it comes to the pandemic. The hardest hit are people of color, African Americans, the Latinx population, Native Americans, what you call First Nations. And we have so much to learn from the First Nations in Canada, in the United States, Indigenous leaders who've been fighting for a sustainable future. And we have to all respect each other. This is a moment where we realize how interdependent we are. What has the pandemic taught us? If we are privileged, we can isolate, we can be protected in our homes, but so many people can't be. And they're on the front lines. They are the nurses and the custodians in hospitals. They're the doctors, they're the grocery store, food deliverers. They're the folks who work the cashiers there. They work in drugstores. They're the people who run mass transportation, the conductors and the trains and the buses. And we are all interdependent. We also need a media that reflects the voices of people on the front lines, not that minority elite. And we're not talking about people of color, but the elite that you get in these networks. So we need to open up the media because it's the way we learn about each other. And we cannot survive alone, even though the pandemic often makes us be alone to be most protected. We have to be together. And the media does connect us, the best kind of media, for us to be able to communicate with each other. I think we have so far to go in the United States. The movements in this country, the pro-democracy movement, the movements, the Black Lives Matter movement that dared to take to the streets, all masked to protect each other and their families, but taking to the streets to protect this nation. those who fight for LGBTQ rights, the environmental movement, indigenous leaders and communities, the peace movement in this country, the economic justice movement. We are all together entering a new era, and we have to do it together. And I think the media is the place where we can have all of those conversations. So I'm so honored to be doing this with you, Linda, to be together Democracy Now! With the national observers that started in Vancouver. And we just have so much work ahead of us, but I really look forward for all of us to do it together.
Amy, thank you so much for giving us your time today. It's, such a pivotal moment, and I know you must be really, really busy. We've learned so much in this 1 hour that as journalists, we have an obligation to hold power to account, and that the media is so essential in the functioning of a democratic society. To all of you on the call, there are links to Democracy Now! In the chat, and I hope you'll support Amy Goodman's work, and I hope you'll support Canada's National Observer. Next week, we'll be talking to the newly elected leader of the Green Party, Annamie Paul. I'm Linda Solomon Wood. Amy, thank you again, and good night to everybody.
Thank you so much, Linda, and peace to everyone. Remember, it's the media that can be the greatest force for peace. So let's hold all of them to it. And check out Democracy Now! We're a daily news hour, and we're at democracynow.org. We broadcast
Thank you, Amy.
live at 8 a.m.
Thank you so much. Okay, bye.